Following the siege of Saguntum by Hannibal Barca in 218 BC, the Romans sent a delegation to Carthage. After receiving an unsatisfactory answer from the Senate, the envoys declared war, and the Second Punic War officially started. The first consul, Publius Cornelius Scipio, was sent to Spain to deal with Hannibal directly, while his colleague, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was sent to Sicily to prepare for an invasion of North Africa. Rather than waiting for the Roman army to arrive in Spain, Hannibal decided to cross into Italy and take the fight directly to the Romans. He marched his grand army across the Pyrenees and then along the Mediterranean coast. Large bribes bought him safe passage through southern Gaul. When Scipio reached Massalia, he received word that Hannibal was crossing the Rhone upstream. While his force was disembarking, Scipio sent some of his cavalry to observe the Carthaginians. Riding up the river, the Romans stumbled upon a Punic scouting party, and the two sides clashed. The Roman cavalry was victorious, and they pursued the Carthaginians all the way to their camp, learning of their position. Scipio marched his force up to the Punic camp, but it was already deserted. Instead of fighting the Roman army, Hannibal decided to push on, and he crossed the Alps, arriving in Italy in October of 218 BC. In this crucial moment, Scipio had to make an important decision that would impact the rest of the war. He sent his older brother, Scipio Calvus, along with the entirety of the army into Spain, while he returned to Italy to personally organize the defense of the peninsula. Out of the 87,000 troops Hannibal had left Carthago Nova with, only 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry reached Italy. Miraculously, around 30 elephants crossed the mountains successfully. During a long march across unfriendly territory, desertions were all too common. The fresh troops were the first to go, leaving Hannibal with mostly seasoned troops, veterans of numerous Spanish campaigns. These veterans and a high number of cavalry would play crucial roles in the upcoming battles. Hannibal found himself in the territory of a Gallic tribe, the Taurini. They were currently engaged in a war with the nearby Insubres and were unwilling to aid Hannibal with either troops or supplies. He decided to send a message to all Gauls south of the Alps by capturing and destroying their chief town. The winter supplies stored in the town would ease Hannibal's troubles for the time being. He could finally allow his troops to rest and prepare for the upcoming battle with the Romans. While resting, Hannibal received word that Scipio was in the area leading a large army. It was uncommon for the Roman consuls to abandon their troops, so Hannibal expected an entire consular army bolstered with additional troops from the area. In order to lift the morale of his men, Hannibal staged a strange ceremony. The Allobrogian prisoners, captured during the crossing of the Alps, were offered a chance to fight for their freedom. The Gallic warriors jumped at this opportunity, and a pair of them were chosen at random. The two men fought to the death in full view of the Carthaginian army. Ultimately, the victor was awarded a horse and a weapon and set free. This was meant to show the soldiers that they too had limited options. They could either win their freedom in battle or die trying. Following this display, Hannibal gave a rousing speech, promising his soldiers lands, money, and even Carthaginian citizenship once they had defeated the Romans. With this, Hannibal started moving down the northern bank of the Po River towards Scipio, who was marching up the river to meet him. During his march, Scipio crossed a tributary of the Po, the river Ticinus, by building a pontoon bridge. Once his army was safely across, his scouts informed him of Hannibal's movements. The two generals now encamped, fortifying their positions. On the next day, Scipio led a large scouting party with all his cavalry. They were supported by velites, lightly armored skirmishers. Hannibal was leading a party of his own. Riding with most of the Punic cavalry, he vastly outnumbered the Romans. When the two armies stumbled upon each other, Scipio, remembering his recent victory in Gaul, decided to ignore the numerical disadvantage and attack Hannibal. He prepared his troops for battle. Velites were placed in the front, with cavalry forming up behind them. The plan was for the velites to throw their javelins into incoming troops and then retreat back to safety, clearing the ground for the cavalry charge. Hoping to win an early victory, Hannibal accepted the challenge. He placed his heavy Spanish cavalry in the center, while his lighter and faster Numidian cavalry was split into two groups and placed on the wings. When the Carthaginians approached, Scipio abandoned his plan and charged through the first line with his cavalry. The confused velites retreated while the two sides clashed. Fighting was fierce, but neither side was giving ground. With the center of both armies now preoccupied, the Numidians swept around the flanks. One wing chased down the still scattered skirmishers, while the other charged the Roman rear, throwing it into disarray. In this confusion, Scipio was badly wounded. He was only saved by the bravery of his young son, who charged into the thick of things and dragged him out. This was none other than Scipio Africanus, the savior of Rome and Hannibal's greatest rival, but this was still many years before the two men would face each other. The Romans now retreated back to camp, suffering heavy casualties in the process. Hannibal didn't press his advantage, expecting a full-scale battle the next day, but during the night, Scipio and his men retreated back across the Ticinus. 600 men stayed behind to destroy the bridge, and they were captured by the Carthaginians. Unable to follow the Romans, the army had to march back upstream to find a place where they could cross the Po. Scipio retreated towards the Roman colony of Placentia, where he rested his troops and cared for the wounded. They were followed by Hannibal, who arrived only a few days later. He formed his troops for battle, but the Romans refused the challenge. This not only bolstered the morale of the Carthaginian troops, but also convinced some Gauls to switch sides. During the night, some 2,000 Gallic warriors abandoned the Roman camp and joined Hannibal's army. The nearby Boii and Insubres, now formally allied with the Carthaginians, and Gallic aid that Hannibal was counting on finally started pouring in. Seeing his position weakened, Scipio used the cover of night to retreat across the Trebia river. He fortified his position on a hilltop overlooking the river and there waited for reinforcements. When the news of Hannibal's arrival in Italy reached Rome, a great panic ensued. For all their pre-war preparations, no one expected that a large army could cross the Alps. Sempronius Longus, who was currently in Lilybaeum preparing his African campaign, was swiftly recalled and ordered to reinforce Scipio. Polybius informs us that the army reached Arminium in only 40 days. From there, they marched towards Scipio, who was still encamped near Trebia. Hannibal was in no rush to force an engagement with the Romans. Fresh Gallic troops were arriving each day, and he took his time to drill them into shape. The garrison commander of nearby Clastidium betrayed the Romans and joined up with Hannibal. Large grain stores in the city eased Punic's supply problems. When Sempronius arrived at the scene, he was eager for a battle as soon as possible. He could see that Hannibal's army was growing by the day, and he wanted to stop that while the balance of power was still in his favor. His actions may have also been forced by the Roman consular year. If he waited out the winter, another set of consuls would be elected, and he would lose his opportunity for eternal glory. His colleague Scipio, who had previously been looking for a fight at the first possible opportunity, was now advising caution, but his words fell on deaf ears and Sempronius took control of the combined army. Hannibal was frequently sending out raiding parties to gather supplies. During one of these raids, Sempronius sent out his cavalry to attack the Carthaginians. Laden with plunder, the raiders couldn't offer any resistance and they were chased back to the camp. The Punic guards reacted quickly and joined the fight. Seeing this, the Romans too sent reinforcements. A small skirmish was about to turn into a full-scale battle as more and more troops arrived from both sides. Hannibal could see that this battle was putting his entire invasion in danger and decided to stop it. He joined his men in front of the camp and formed them into a solid line. The men were refrained from advancing and stood their ground near the palisades. Seeing this wall of Carthaginian troops forming up, the Romans pulled back and the skirmish was over. Hannibal, who is known for carefully planning his every engagement, realized he could do little to influence this battle if it got out of hand. Showing great restraint on his part, he prevented a possible disaster and a quick end to his campaign. On the other hand, Sempronius saw this skirmish as a Roman victory, only strengthening his desire to face Hannibal in a real battle. Hannibal spent a few days riding up and down the river, trying to find the best spot for an engagement. Seeing a good hiding spot, he sent his brother Mago with 1,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry to set an ambush during the night. In the early morning, he sent his Numidian cavalry to harass the Romans, hoping to draw Sempronius out. The consul took the bait and sent his entire cavalry in pursuit. The Numidians were careful to avoid a close engagement and retreated slowly across the river. Sempronius now fully committed and marched out with the rest of his army. The infantry slowly crossed the river and formed into the usual three lines on the west bank of the Trebia. The cavalry was recalled, joining the infantry on the wings. The Romans were roused from their sleep by the Numidians and had no time to eat. The Trebia was flooding at the time, and the men got wet while crossing. This force was almost twice the size of a regular consular army, and it was mostly made up of fresh recruits. According to some accounts, it took them almost 5 hours to finally form up for battle. By this time, they were already hungry, cold, and exhausted, but there was no turning back now. Hannibal planned for all of this. His troops had enough time to do all the necessary preparations while the Romans were still crossing the river. He now marched out with the entire force. Compared to the 32,000 Roman infantry, Hannibal had only 20,000. He He had to place all of his infantry into a single thin line. The Gauls were positioned in the center, with Spanish and Libyan troops on their sides. One advantage Hannibal did have was 10,000 cavalry, compared to only 4,000 Romans. They were placed on the wings along with the elephants. And thus, in December of 218 BCE, the first pitched battle of the war, the Battle of Trebia, started. Fighting was fierce from both sides. The Roman center came in strong, and the Carthaginians started giving ground. The outnumbered Roman cavalry could put up only feeble resistance, and they soon broke, fleeing back to the camp. The Punic cavalry now encircled the Romans. Sensing an opportunity, Mago sprang from his hiding spot and joined the cavalry. Although encircled, the Roman center continued pushing, and they broke the Gallic troops in the center. Some 10,000 legionaries marched through the Punic line. They had no intention of returning to the battle, and still in formation, they marched towards Placentia. The rest of the troops were not as lucky. While some managed to escape, most were cut down. The Battle of Trebia was the first of Hannibal's 3 great victories. The exact casualties are unknown, but it is estimated that the Romans lost somewhere between 20 and 30,000 men, while Hannibal lost only around 5,000. Most of the Punic losses were suffered by the easily replaceable Celtic allies. As the news of this battle spread, more and more Gauls joined Hannibal's cause. He could now see that his plan was working. Victories on the field could convince the Roman allies to switch sides and turn on their former masters. However, to persuade more communities to join his side, he would have to march down the Italian peninsula, deep into the Roman heartland. For the time being, Hannibal was stuck in Cisalpine Gaul. Winter was setting in, and he would have to wait it out in the north. An unusually cold spell hit his camp, and a great number of soldiers, along with all but one elephant, perished. The great victory ensured that none of his troops abandoned him during these harsh winter months. On the contrary, his army was doubled in size by the time he was ready to march again in the spring. In the aftermath of the battle, Sempronius tried to downplay this catastrophe, even blaming the bad weather for his defeat. But when the Senate learned the real extent of the disaster, they were thrown into a frenzy. Luckily, the consular elections gave them an opportunity for a fresh start. Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Gaius Flaminius were elected consuls of 217. Flaminius was a new man, or the first member of his family to be elected to the highest office. He was somewhat of a populist, passing a land reform law during his tenure as a tribune of the plebs. During his first consulship in 223 BCE, he led a successful campaign against the Insubres, who now made up a large part of Hannibal's army. Each consul was assigned a new army and sent north with orders to stop Hannibal's advance at all costs. As winter slowly gave way to spring, a new campaigning season was at hand, and Hannibal could finally continue his journey. He marched out of Cisalpine Gaul with more than 50,000 men, a far cry from the comparably modest army that crossed the Alps. Hannibal was now faced with yet another mountain range in his path. The Apennine Mountains run down the Italian peninsula, splitting it into western and eastern halves. There was only a few convenient crossing spots over the mountains, and Hannibal would have to commit to one side or the other. He could either go east and march down the Adriatic coast, or he could cross the Apennines in the north and march through Etruria. The Romans were well aware of this, and Servilius was stationed in Arminium to defend the eastern path, while Flaminius was covering the various passes across the mountains from Arretium. Flaminius was eager to begin operations, and he left Rome before officially taking auspices on the 15th of March. This was unconventional and seen as a bad omen. He was recalled to Rome to retake auspices, but he ignored the Senate. This blatant disrespect for the gods would not go unpunished. Hannibal chose a more difficult but more lucrative path. The rich lands of Etruria could easily sustain his large army. This path would also lead him directly to Rome. He crossed the mountains near the town of Porretta, reaching the marshy grounds around the river Arno. It took them 3 days to force their way through the marshes, suffering heavy losses in the process. Hannibal himself was one of the casualties, as he lost one of his eyes to an infection. He had to be carried out by the last surviving elephant, the brave Surus mentioned by Cato. After finally emerging from the marshes, Hannibal allowed his men several days of rest. During this time, he sent scouts in all directions and learned that Flaminius was encamped near Arretium. Instead of facing him immediately, Hannibal passed him by and led his troops into Etruria, where they could freely plunder the land. Even though he was outnumbered 2-1, Flaminius set off in pursuit, just as Hannibal had hoped. His senior officers advised him to wait for reinforcements from Servilius, but he had no intention of sharing glory with his colleague. The Carthaginian march away from the Roman army resembled a frightened enemy fleeing in haste. giving Romans false hopes of an easy victory. Polybius informs us that the army was swollen by volunteers from ravaged communities who hoped to sell defeated Carthaginians into slavery. Flaminius now picked up his pace and caught up to Hannibal near Lake Trasimene. A narrow path ran along the shore of the lake. It was bound by water on one side and steep wooded hills on the other. Riding along the coast, Hannibal saw an opportunity for setting up an ambush. He reached the other side of the lake and built a camp in a visible position. The Romans, who could clearly see the Carthaginians on the other side of the lake, encamped for the night, hoping to finally catch them the next day. As night fell, the Punic troops quietly abandoned the camp and hid among the trees on the hillside. The Spanish and Libyan troops were placed nearest to the camp. Next to them were the Gauls, and on the far side, closest to the Roman position, was the cavalry. On the misty morning of the 21st of June 217 BC, Flaminius set out with his troops along the shore of Lake Trasimene. The unsuspecting Romans marched right into the Punic trap. The Carthaginians showed great restraint and waited for Hannibal's signal to charge in. When the Roman vanguard finally reached the Spanish and Libyan troops at the far end of the path, the signal was given and all troops simultaneously charged down the mountains. There was no time for the Romans to form a battle line, and they had to defend individually or in small groups. Most of the men were confused, as mist prevented them from seeing the enemy, only hearing the sounds of battle all around them. The fighting was heaviest in the middle, where the Celts again suffered heavy casualties. Even in the face of certain death, the Roman troops stood their ground. Flaminius rode up and down the column, organizing his troops as best as he could. One of the Gauls recognized the consul and charged at him on his horse. He broke through the bodyguards and impaled Flaminius. The nearby troops pushed back the Gauls and saved his body, but the consul was already dead. Eventually, the Roman vanguard managed to break through the Punic blockade, and some 6,000 troops escaped the slaughter. When they realized no friendly troops were behind them, they could only look back in horror. As the mist slowly began to thin out, a great Roman calamity was plain to see. With the death of their consul, the Romans finally lost heart. All organized defense was broken. The men abandoned their weapons and started fleeing. Some jumped into the lake only to drown, while others were run down by the Punic cavalry. The vanguard, seeing no way of aiding their friends, retreated to a nearby village. Later in the day, they were surrounded by one of the Punic officers, Hannibal, and some Spanish troops. The 6,000 Romans surrendered under the condition they could go free, but Hannibal had no intention of honoring this deal. The Romans were enslaved, but as usual, the allied troops were well treated and eventually sent back home. Hannibal's stated goal was the liberation of Italians from Roman oppression. All captured allied troops during the campaign were treated in the same manner and released. Hannibal hoped that acting in this way would endear him to the Italians, who would eventually join his side when the time was right. The Battle of Lake Trasimene is one of the biggest ambushes in military history. Polybius tells us that 15,000 Romans were killed and most of the remaining 10,000 were captured. The Punic losses were a mere 1,500 and again mostly Gauls. This battle shows the true brilliance of Hannibal as a commander. His tactical knowledge was unparalleled, and he could seemingly predict every move his opponents would make. The second of Hannibal's great victories would throw Rome into a panicked frenzy. An enemy general was freely marching across their homeland and easily dealing with everything thrown at him. It was now time for the Romans to change their approach. In the years following the battle, more and more blame was placed on Flaminius himself. Unlike some generals who presided over terrible defeats, Flaminius had no influential family members who could steer the narrative in his favor. Livy describes him as a rash and aggressive demagogue who used the poor masses to overcome all opposition in the Senate. He was said to be a man of bold words, but little talent to show for it. His unwillingness to respect tradition was often blamed for the disaster. In these situations, it's especially hard to separate fact from fiction. Up to this point, Flaminius had a relatively successful career, especially for a new man. Only a handful of men in Rome ever rose to the highest office, and even fewer of them held it multiple times. He also served as tribune of the plebs, praetor, and censor, achieving some success in all these roles. Contrary to Livy's claims, the Roman elections were heavily rigged in favor of the rich and powerful, and Flaminius must have had some support among the senators. However, following his defeat, all his friends quickly turned against him, and thus began the assassination of his character in ancient sources. When Servilius got word of Hannibal's movements, he set out immediately to aid Flaminius. He sent his entire cavalry, some 4,000 horsemen, ahead of the rest of the army. The Punic scouts saw them well in advance, and Hannibal set a trap. He was successful, killing or capturing most of them. The consular army was now left without cavalry support, and they posed no significant threat to the Carthaginians. In the days following the battle, the rumors of a great defeat started spreading through the city, as more and more survivors slowly returned to Rome. A praetor, Marcus Pomponius, addressed the populace in the forum by simply proclaiming, "We were defeated in a great battle." The people were thrown into a panic. Losing an army was always disastrous, but losing two in such a short period of time was catastrophic. For the first time in centuries, the safety of the Eternal City was called into question. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and Quintus Fabius Maximus was appointed dictator. In sharp contrast to Flaminius, Quintus was a member of one of the most influential families in Rome, the Fabii. His grandfather, the famous Fabius Maximus Rullianus, was a hero of the Samnite Wars. He was 5-time consul and once a dictator, an incredible feat his grandson would eventually surpass. Fabius had already served as consul twice, and he was seen as a steady hand who could guide Rome to victory. Marcus Minucius Rufus was chosen as the master of the horse, and the two men did their best to prepare the defenses of the city. Utmost care was taken to properly respect all religious obligations. They even consulted the Sibylline books, the ancient books of prophecies that date all the way back to the monarchy. This flurry of activity finally put the people of Rome at ease. Hannibal had no intentions of marching on Rome, and he crossed the Apennines. Along the way, his troops continued ravaging the countryside, gathering even more supplies. After finally reaching the Adriatic coast, Hannibal gave his troops ample time to rest and treat their wounds. They would periodically move their camp along the coast in order to gain access to new raiding opportunities. For the first time since leaving Spain, Hannibal was able to send a message to Carthage. The news of his victories caused great elation in the city. He was promised support from his countrymen, but little of it would ever reach him. Back in Rome, Fabius raised a new army and marched towards Servilius. The consul was sent to Ostia to take control of the new fleet gathering there, while the dictator combined the two armies and set off in pursuit of Hannibal, who was still moving south. Fabius and his 40,000 troops caught up to him near Aegae in Apulia. In contrast to other Roman generals of the time, Fabius was cautious in his approach, and he extensively scouted the area. Upon meeting him, Hannibal immediately tried to offer battle, but there was no answer from the dictator. It quickly became clear that Fabius had no intention of putting his army in danger. His fresh recruits had little hope against the battle-hardened Carthaginians. Instead, he followed Hannibal for months, always holding the high ground. Although avoiding a pitched battle, the Romans frequently harassed the Punic foragers, putting strain on their supply lines. With each consecutive victory, Fabius was slowly rebuilding the confidence of his men. The villagers were advised to abandon their farms and take refuge in the nearby forts. The Carthaginians would lose too much trying to besiege one of these forts, and they would usually just move on to the next area. Hannibal now descended from the Samnite mountains to the fertile lands of Campania. He started plundering the richest fields in the whole of Italy, the Ager Falernus, hoping this would finally provoke the Romans into attacking him, or convince Capua and the Greek cities to switch sides. But the Campanians stayed loyal to Rome, just as they did some 60 years ago when another great general, Pyrrhus of Epirus, tried to sway them to his side. As always, Fabius looked from the safety of the mountains, refusing to take the bait. Instead, he positioned his troops along the narrow passes leading away from the valley, effectively entrapping Hannibal. His patience and hard work paid off, and the Romans finally got the upper hand. Hannibal, realizing he had no easy way out of the valley, had to get creative. He gathered up all the oxen and strapped torches to their horns. In the night, the Carthaginians lit the torches and drove the cattle up the ridge. Seeing this mass of lights, some 4,000 Roman troops holding the pass believed Hannibal was trying to escape, and they descended upon him. After getting close, the men realized they had been tricked, but they were suddenly attacked by the Punic skirmishers. Seeing this commotion, higher officers, and especially Minucius, pressured Fabius to attack, but he refused to budge. He, perhaps rightly, believed that his inexperienced troops would find it too difficult to fight in the dead of night. Meanwhile, Hannibal and his army were ascending the pass in complete darkness, unseen by the Romans. As the sun came up, Hannibal's success was plain to see. Caught in a desperate position, he used his cunning to evade the Romans and escape into Samnium. Fabius was left humiliated, and he could only return to following Hannibal around. From the very beginning, his strategy was seen as cowardly, and he was despised by the highly militaristic society of Rome. This blunder only strengthened the view that Fabius was inept for leadership in such difficult times. Calls for his removal could be heard in the city, a highly unusual occurrence for a serving dictator. When he returned to Rome to attend some religious duties, he left Minucius in charge, with strict orders to avoid contact with the enemy. Minucius was one of the biggest critics of the dictator, and he sought an engagement at the first possible opportunity. Attacking the unorganized Carthaginian foragers, he won a large skirmish. The news of this victory spread like wildfire, soon reaching Rome. In an unprecedented move, the tribune of the plebs Metellus granted the imperium to Minucius. This meant that the two men had equal power. The army was split in half, and each of them took control of a standard consular army. Predictably, Hannibal lured Minucius into a trap. During the night, he concealed some 5,000 of his best soldiers in the surrounding area. The next morning, he deployed some of his men on the hill overlooking the Roman camp. Minucius was keen on driving them off, but Hannibal sent more and more reinforcements. Eventually, Minucius sent out his entire army towards the Carthaginians. The Romans were fighting uphill, and they slowly started giving ground. At that moment, the concealed Carthaginians sprang from the woods, encircling Minucius. Hannibal had done it again. Another Roman army was caught in a desperate situation and would have been utterly defeated were it not for Fabius. He sallied forth from his camp, arriving in a nick of time to push back the Carthaginians. Hannibal, choosing to spare his already exhausted soldiers, retreated back to the nearby town of Geronium, where he would spend the winter months. Realizing he was no match for the two great generals, Minucius relinquished his imperium, returning full command to the dictator. On a personal level, he hailed Fabius as a father, a powerful gesture in ancient Rome. The rest of the year passed in a relative calm as both sides prepared for winter. In December of 217, a 6-month term expired and Fabius returned to Rome, leaving the army in the hands of the consuls. The style of warfare used by Fabius would eventually bear his name. Today it's known as the Fabian strategy, and it was often employed when a smaller army had to face a far superior invader. Avoiding battle at all costs gave Rome enough time to recover from the previous defeats. Although mocked at the time, even the proud Romans eventually realized that Fabius alone assured their survival. For his actions, he was given the nickname Cunctator, meaning the delayer. As the new consular elections were approaching, a powerful faction in the city called for a more decisive leader who would bring them to victory. They would soon get their way. It seems that the only general in Italy who could fully appreciate the brilliance of Fabius's plan was Hannibal himself. His position was significantly weakened without losing a single battle. Not a single Italian city defected to his side, ruining his main plan. His Gallic troops were getting anxious due to this aimless wandering. We even hear rumors of Spanish troops planning a mutiny. Another winless year, and Hannibal would find himself in a desperate position. The Romans would make sure that doesn't happen. In 216 BC, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus were elected consuls on a platform of finally destroying Hannibal's army. These two men would preside over the greatest defeat in Roman history. Varro was a new man, and he would suffer the same fate as Flaminius. He is described as a demagogue with radical views. He is even said to be the son of a butcher, but this claim is dubious at best. Even though he survived the following battle, he is remembered as the chief architect of the disaster. On the other hand, Paulus had powerful descendants who could steer the narrative in his favor. He is described as a calm and careful leader who advocated for the continuation of the Fabian strategy. We should note that his grandson, Scipio Aemilianus, was the patron of our primary source, Polybius. We should thus be careful when examining his writings as well as the work of later authors, who undoubtedly had access to his histories. Why would the Romans, who were starved for a battle, elect someone who was advising against it? In a desperate move, the Romans raised 8 legions. In addition, each legion was expanded from 3,000 to 5,000 men. The legions were supported by an additional 8 alii of the same size, meaning that the Romans mustered an unprecedented army of 80,000 men. The infantry was supported by a further 6,000 cavalry. Each consul was given the equivalent of 2 entire consular armies, and rather than splitting their forces, the two of them marched out together. Additionally, another army, 25,000 strong, was assigned to Lucius Postumius Albinus. He was given orders to march north and invade Hannibal's allies in Cisalpine Gaul. The people of Rome, and especially the soldiers, were in high spirits. Even though they had suffered 2 great defeats recently, the Romans still believed in their innate supremacy over the Carthaginians. The allies were as eager to fight as the Romans themselves. Their communities had been ravaged the previous year, and they were keen on revenge. A large number of senators accompanied the army, either as military tribunes, in the cavalry, or as advisors to the consuls. And thus one of the largest armies in Roman history marched towards Hannibal's winter quarters in Geronium. As the crop started to ripen in late spring, Hannibal finally moved out. He received news of a large Roman supply depot in the ruined fortress of Cannae. By the time Hannibal captured the fort, the combined Roman army was fast approaching. Learning quickly from their past mistakes, the Romans moved along the shore, giving Hannibal no opportunity to set an ambush. We are told that Paulus didn't want to battle on the open ground around Cannae. He believed it would benefit Hannibal's numerically superior cavalry, but he recognized that the armies were too close together for a safe retreat. Furthermore, retreating now would be a huge hit to Roman morale. With no other choice, the army slowly advanced, moving their camp a little closer each day. The Romans were now in position, with their camp on the north side of the river. Paulus sent a part of the army to set up a smaller camp on the south side, with orders to protect the foraging parties. Hannibal, who was encamped near Cannae on the south side, now crossed the river and moved his camp opposite the Romans. Feeding a large army was always difficult, but in this situation both sides found it almost impossible. The sheer size of the Roman army presented a problem of its own. They were used to feeding armies less than a quarter the size. On the other side, the Carthaginians would soon deplete all supplies from Cannae, and lacking any allies in the area, they would find themselves in a difficult situation. The size of the Roman army intimidated the Carthaginians. According to some accounts, even Hannibal himself contemplated abandoning the army and escaping to Cisalpine Gaul. During one meeting, one of the officers, Gisco, commented on their numerical advantage. The solemn general replied, "There are a lot of Romans over there, but there is not one called Gisco," prompting a burst of laughter from the gathered officers. Although Hannibal lightened the mood a little, the seriousness of the situation was not lost on anyone present. The mood was quite different in the Roman camp. After years of defeats, they were finally staring into the eyes of a great victory. When the two Roman consuls combined their armies, they would take hold of command on alternate days. This meant that the consul in charge could choose to fight or to stay back in the camp. The days before the battle were filled with frequent skirmishes, with neither side gaining a significant advantage. On the 1st of August, Hannibal led out his troops, but Paulus, who was in command on that day, refused the challenge. The following day, Varro took the initiative and marched the legions to the south side of the river. The army was so large that there was not enough space to deploy them in the usual manner. The 55,000 heavy infantry were packed more densely than usual. The gaps between the maniples were smaller, and each maniple was deeper than it was customary. They were still formed in the usual three lines, with 15,000 light velites in front. This dense formation made the inexperienced army easier to control. 2,400 Roman cavalry were placed on the right wing, while the remaining 3,600 allied horse covered the left wing. In both previous defeats, the Carthaginian center collapsed under the weight of the legions. The Romans must have realized this was their best bet for defeating Hannibal. For this plan to work, the cavalry would have to play a crucial role. Although outnumbered, they would have to hold the Punic counterparts long enough for the center to break through. For this reason, each of the consuls took command of one part of the cavalry. Paulus rode with the Romans on the right, while Varro was with the allies on the left. The former consul, Servilius, was put in charge of the center. The Romans were so confident in their victory that 10,000 men were left behind to defend the camp, with orders to attack the Punic base once the battle started. Seeing the Romans cross the river, Hannibal sent out his entire force. From his positioning, it seems that he had perfectly predicted the Roman plan. 20,000 Celts and 4,000 Spanish troops were mixed together and formed the center. They were all placed into a single line, roughly the size of the Roman center. The 10,000 Libyan troops, wearing Roman equipment gathered at Trasimene, were split into two and placed on the wings. They were formed into deep, narrow columns and hidden behind the line. Roughly 8,000 skirmishers were positioned in front of the first line. The 4,000 light Numidian cavalry were placed on the right flank, while the remaining 6,000 heavy cavalry were placed on the left. The most important action would be fought in the center, and Hannibal with his brother Mago took position behind the Spanish and Celtic troops. One of the officers, Hasdrubal, took control of the heavy cavalry, while Hanno commanded the Numidians. Both sides were now finally ready for the battle to commence. To reiterate, the Romans had 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. On the other side, the Carthaginians had 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. From the outset, Hannibal's victory was not at all assured. His plan was extremely risky, as the Punic infantry was outnumbered almost 2 to 1. If the Libyan troops failed to stop the Roman advance, no amount of cavalry could turn the tides. And thus, on the 2nd of August 216 BC, one of the most famous battles of antiquity started. Hannibal sent the center of his Spanish and Celtic troops forward, forming a crescent shape towards the Romans. On the Roman right, Paulus and the Roman cavalry charged at their Punic counterparts. Heavily outnumbered, the Romans were quickly broken, falling into a complete rout. Rather than abandoning the battlefield, Paulus dismounted and joined the Roman center. The legions now finally reached the bulging Punic line, and a fierce action was fought in the middle. The Romans came on strong, but the Spanish and Celtic troops held their ground. The Celts were known to be forceful initially, but quickly tire out and retreat. At Cannae, they offered fierce resistance for a prolonged period of time. The presence of Spanish troops among their ranks gave them stability. Eventually, the sheer number of Romans pressing forth finally prevailed. The Punic line started giving ground, no more than a step at a time. The front line was now flattened, yet the Romans continued to push forward. With each step, the Romans gained momentum, and eventually the Carthaginians were formed in a reverse crescent. Seeing their enemy give way, Paulus and nearby tribunes ordered more and more troops forward. Any semblance of the three-line formation was lost, and the Romans collapsed into a heap of men pushing forward. Finally, after enduring as long as they could, the Punic center crumbled, and the Spaniards and Celts started fleeing. The Roman forces were elated. Victory was within their grasp. In this moment, Hannibal gave a signal to the Libyans, and they fell on the Romans with all their might. For all this time, the Libyan troops had been resting while their enemy fought a grueling battle. Their Roman equipment further confused the exhausted legionaries. The Roman advance was stopped in its tracks, and victory was snatched right from their hands. While the infantry was advancing, the Numidians harassed the allied cavalry, refusing to fully engage. On the left, Hasdrubal was done chasing the Romans, and he gathered up all the heavy cavalry. They then wheeled around and charged towards Varro. Seeing the enemy fast approaching, the Roman cavalry broke and fled, leaving the infantry to fend for themselves. The Numidians chased after Varro, but Hasdrubal once more rallied his men and charged the Roman rear. Hannibal had done the impossible. He encircled the larger Roman army with his significantly smaller force. Although the Romans still outnumbered their enemy, they couldn't offer any significant resistance. What followed was a prolonged slaughter. For hours, the Carthaginians hacked away at the ever-shrinking circle of Romans. By nightfall, 50,000 men were lying dead on the field. At Cannae, the Carthaginian casualties were high, but for the Romans they were downright catastrophic. Hannibal lost 4,000 Gauls, 1,500 Spaniards and Libyans, and 200 cavalry. This amounts to more than 1/10 of his troops, an exceedingly high percentage for a victorious army in ancient times. Most of the losses were suffered once the center broke, but also while hacking at the stubborn Romans after they were encircled. On the other side, Polybius claims 70,000 Romans perished, with a further 10,000 captured. The more conservative Livy claims 48,000 dead and 21,000 captured, including those left behind at the camp. Whatever the case, these numbers are disastrous. Among the dead were 1 consul, 2 proconsuls, 2 quaestors, 29 military tribunes, and an additional 80 senators. A staggering 1/3 of the Senate was annihilated within a single afternoon. For all its size, the Battle of Cannae is completely absent from the archaeological record. The weapons and armor were extremely valuable in ancient times. In the days following any battle, the dead would be stripped of their valuables, and few weapons were ever left on the ground. The lack of other smaller artifacts or bones is harder to explain. The fields around Cannae have been cultivated by Italian farmers for more than 2 millennia after the battle. Over that long period, any items left in the ground were probably destroyed by plows and draft animals. Another factor to consider is the ever-changing course of the nearby river. The exact location of the river in the 3rd century BC is unknown. It is entirely possible that archaeologists simply haven't looked at the right place yet. We have to take all of this into account to explain the complete lack of any archaeological evidence of one of the largest battles fought on Italian soil. Here we come to one of the greatest unanswered questions in history. What if Hannibal had marched on Rome immediately after Cannae? The Romans believed that the delays Hannibal made after the battle were the sole reason for the city's survival. Some modern authors tend to agree, while others are more skeptical about this claim. Although the entire Roman army was just annihilated, they could still gather enough troops to man the walls. Hannibal couldn't take Rome by storm and would have to settle in for a lengthy siege. Even though the Carthaginian fleet had recently sailed along the west coast of Italy, in the event of a siege, the entire Roman navy would rush to aid the city. Hannibal had no hopes of taking Rome without naval support, and he knew this. His only bet would be to force the Romans to surrender. But as we have already seen throughout this entire series, the Romans were nothing if not stubborn. In the previous 2 years, the Romans and their allies lost upwards of 100,000 men. The male population of the city was decimated, and the leadership was left in shambles. In the face of all of this, the Romans chose to press on. As we shall soon see, they had no intention of negotiating with Hannibal, and any hopes of a surrender were misplaced. It is possible, as some authors claim, that the sight of the victorious army at their gates was just the push the Romans needed to consider peace negotiations, but this we can never truly know. On the day following the battle, Hannibal captured the Roman camps. The soldiers, still contemplating the scale of the disaster, offered no resistance. The remnants of the Roman army that managed to escape the slaughter started gathering in nearby towns. Varro, with only 70 horsemen, arrived at Venusia. A larger group, numbering several thousand, fled to nearby Canusium. Among these men were the young Publius Scipio and the son of Fabius Maximus. Eventually, as many as 10,000 men gathered there before Varro arrived to take command. These survivors would soon be formed into 2 legions and sent into Sicily. They were forbidden from disbanding or returning to Italy for the duration of the war. Hannibal gathered all Roman prisoners, some 8,000 of them, and chose a delegation of 10 men among them. They were sent to Rome to negotiate the ransom. Punic officer Carthalo was sent with them, presumably to negotiate the surrender of Rome. Arriving near the city, Carthalo received a message from the Senate, forbidding him from even entering Rome. This was a shock to the Carthaginians. By all conventions of the ancient world, the Romans lost the war, and there was no more point in needlessly losing men. Any civilized community, from the shores of the Atlantic to the far-flung reaches of India, would have surrendered by now. But just as Pyrrhus had learned years ago, the Romans had no such civilities. They refused to negotiate with any enemy still on their soil. As for the prisoners, the Senate had no intention of getting them back. A vote was passed to refuse the ransom, and the private citizens were forbidden from dealing with the Carthaginians. Some of the 8,000 men were executed, while others were sold into slavery. As the news of this great defeat slowly spread across Italy, some communities finally saw a chance to break away from Rome. Soon much of southern Italy would rise in open revolt. Join us next time as we continue our discussion on the Second Punic War. Thank you for watching our video. We hope you liked it. If you enjoyed this series, consider supporting us on Patreon. It would mean a lot to us and help us make even more videos in the future.